Buenas tardes, bienvenidos una vez más al canal de YouTube del Instituto Cervantes de Manchester y Leeds. Hoy tenemos el privilegio de recibir al profesor Alexander Samson dentro del programa Hispanglia, que como algunos de ustedes ya conocen, desde hace ya varios años tiene una serie de encuentros en los que tratamos de analizar la interacción, las relaciones entre Gran Bretaña y España y cómo estos dos países de larga historia, bueno, pues han interactuado y se han influido de diferentes momentos de la historia en diferentes aspectos también, no solamente en el análisis histórico, sino también la literatura, en el arte, en fin, todas las manifestaciones de la cultura y del diálogo intercultural entre España y Gran Bretaña. Good evening and welcome to the Manchester and Leeds Instituto Cervantes YouTube channel. My name is Pedro Eusebio. I'm the director of the Cultural Center in Northern England of Manchester and Leeds. And today I have the pleasure of introducing the conference on Hispanic words in English Renaissance culture as a part of the 6th edition of the cycle called Hispanglia, the Traces of Spain in the United Kingdom. Welcome everybody, welcome to our audience, but especially to our guest, Alexander Samson, for being with us today. The 2022 program will offer a platform of various historical figures whose contributions towards the creation of shared vision between England and Spain will be highlighted and analyzed by various leading researchers and academics in different fields. The conference today will be delivered by Dr. Alexander Samson, to whom we are very grateful, as I said, for accepting our invitation to talk about his research in this field. Briefly, the conference on the Hispanic words in English Renaissance culture concentrates on the analysis of the confrontation between England and Spain, specifically in the second half of the 16th century, and underlines how these events went on to spark and influence knowledge in variety of fields ranging from science to literature and thought. I would like now to introduce our guest, Dr. Alexander Samson, who is a reader in early modern studies of the University College in London, having been educated in the Universities of Leeds, Sussex, and Queen Mary, and following fellowships at the Universities of St Andrews in Scotland and Warwick. His research interests include the early colonial history of the Americas, Anglo-Spanish intercultural interactions, and of course, an early modern English and Spanish drama. In 2020, his book called Marie and Philip, The Marriage of Tudor England and Habsburg Spain was published by Manchester University Press. He also runs the Golden Age and Renaissance Research Seminar, as well as being directors of the University College London Centre for Early Modern Exchanges and the Centre for the Editing, Life and Letters. But before to pass the floor to Alexander, I will let you know that we will have 15 minutes for questions and answers that you can put on the chat and that I will put to our guests today. So without further ado, I give the floor to Dr. Alexander Samson. Muchísimas gracias y espero que disfruten de la conferencia.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Pedro, y muchísimas gracias a todo el mundo por estar aquí. It's a great honor and a great pleasure to be here addressing the Instituto Cervantes in Manchester. I'm just going, let me just change that. I'm going to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint presentation, which I'm going to pop on the screen for us. So hopefully everybody can see that okay. Just give me a shout if that's not visible. So just to start off and really just to kind of, in a sense, the image that they've used, so thank you very much for doing this wonderful publicity for this talk, because the map actually that you've used really in some senses encapsulates the argument of the lecture that I'm about to give today. So as we can see, it represents Ireland on one side and England, although it's not very recognizable because, you know, early modern cartography in this period was not quite, you know, as precise as things are today. But on the right-hand side, we have a depiction of England. And what you will notice is that on the coat of arms, which is very prominently displayed, the left-hand side has been scratched off from the coat of arms. It's been effectively defaced. And there's a very good reason for that. And that's because this is the Queen Mary Atlas, which was created by Diogo Homem and was supposed to have been presented to Mary I in 1558. But unfortunately, as you all know, what happened in 1558 was that Mary died. And so having spent all this time creating this lavish, beautifully drawn atlas, Diogo Homem had a slight problem, which was, who do I present it to now? One of the reasons perhaps why Mary may have commissioned the atlas was probably as a gift for Philip. And so the fact that you have the conjoined arms of England and Spain prominently displayed over England would have made sense. But given Mary's death, whoever created the artist who kind of did this, has clearly scratched off the coat of arms in order to be able to gift the atlas to Elizabeth instead, without it being insulting. So I think that that's kind of, in a sense, encapsulates quite nicely some of the things that I'm going to talk about today, which is effectively the erasure of Spain from English culture and English history in the 16th and 17th centuries. So what I'm going to do first of all is I'm going to talk about a couple of things. I'm going to talk about, the talk will basically have three sections. I'm going to talk about the Black Legend and anti-Catholicism to start with a little bit. Then I'm going to talk about translation. And then finally, I'm going to kind of come on to cultural influence. Spain is a model, both exemplary and anti-exemplary for early modern England, and try to kind of, I think, detail what a huge and massively important influence I think Spain was. And then finally, I think I'm going to finish off with a few remarks about popular culture, which I think speak to the persistence of this kind of particular image of the Anglo-Hispanic relationship in this period. Okay, so where does this all begin for me? For me, my whole fascination in some ways with Spain and England in the period started off with something like this. And this is from Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy and its connection with political and social circumstances from the earliest times to the present day. And it's, you know, at the kind of beginning of this really famous kind of popular book that Bertrand Russell wrote in 1961, or sorry, before that, second edition in 1961. It was certainly a book that he wrote, I think, probably for money as opposed to for, you know, out of a kind of deep sense of research. But nevertheless, he writes, the new national monarchies in France, Spain, and England had in their own territories a power with which neither the Pope nor the Emperor could interfere. The national state, largely owing to gunpowder, acquired an influence over men's thoughts and feelings which it had not had before, and which progressively destroyed the Roman belief in the unity of civilization. What had happened in the Great Age of Greece happened again in Renaissance Italy. Traditional restraints disappeared because they were seen to be associated with superstition. The liberation from fetters made individuals energetic and creative, producing a rare fluorescence of genius. But the anarchy and treachery which inevitably resulted from the decay of morals made Italians collectively impotent. They fell, like the Greeks, under the domination of nations less civilized than themselves, but not so destitute of social cohesion. The result, however, was less disastrous than in the case of Greece, because the newly powerful nations, with the exception of Spain, showed themselves as capable of great achievement as the Italians had been. That phrase, with the exception of Spain, essentially excludes Spain from the kind of history of Western philosophy, the history of civilization in Western Europe in many ways, which is seen here as flowing directly from Italy to France and England. So this persistent image of Spain as somehow peripheral to European Renaissance culture is something of a mystery. And it's been the subject of critique for over a century, catalyzed obviously in Julián Juderías's infamous La Leyenda Negra y la Verdad Histórica. And Juderías's book about the black reputation, you know, he's not the person who actually coined this term, but he's certainly the person who popularized it. But this notion that Spanish history labors under the shadow of a black legend, you know, this is an idea which has been very influential in the 20th century, and it's still very influential and very politically contested in Spain itself today. There's an enormously popular book called Imperiophobia, which makes a very strong argument, although from quite a specific political position, that Spain's history has been very unfairly written in comparison to the more positive way in which the imperial history of other European nations has been written. So that really, I think, is one of the crucial kind of key points. This notion of a black legend, that somehow Spain's contribution to Western European civilization in the early modern period has been minimized, occluded, or forgotten. The Gunpowder Plot came within a whisker of destroying the entire British establishment in 1605 in a terrorist attack that would have rivaled 9/11 for its spectacular horror. Penny for the guy, bonfire night, fireworks, and especially in places like Lewes. I don't know if anyone here has been to the Lewes fireworks, but they're an annual reminder to everybody living in this country, and a kind of implicit part of popular culture, of our state's survival of Catholic conspiracy. Interestingly, 1605, of course, was the same year as the Treaty of London, which ended the Anglo-Spanish War, which had lasted from 1585 to 1604. Now, a lot of my research has been focused on unpacking what anti-Catholicism has meant in historiographical terms. It's been very kindly mentioned by a recently published book on Mary and Philip, the marriage of Tudor England and Habsburg Spain. And on one level, this is a book that attempts to address this gap that not many people, when they think of Tudor England, remember the fact that actually Tudor England had a Spanish king for 4 years. And why is that the case, that it comes as such a surprise to so many people when the Tudors are nothing short of a kind of British obsession, if the numbers of TV shows and other things is only to go by? So a lot of my research has been thinking about how does anti-Catholicism influence and affect the historiography of Spain and England in the early modern period. So far from Spain and England being states irrevocably separated by religion, the continuous presence of a persecuted Catholic minority until the modern period, when the first attempts to rewrite the Marian period in a more sympathetic vein appeared, the fundamental problem was not religious difference, but a fifth column of sympathizers who threatened the homogeneous integrity of Protestant England, not to mention the vulnerable flank of a religiously mixed Ireland. In the 19th century, the Catholic John Lingard, along with Agnes Strickland, the latter denounced as a papistical sympathizer because of her historical work, they both produced histories that overturned the image of Mary I as a cruel tyrant, the image of Bloody Mary. However, to explain without condoning the burnings, both of these historians emphasized her personal misfortunes and minimized her agency. To defend Mary I in this way, immediately after the repeal of the Test Acts in 1829, avoided courting controversy unnecessarily. Lingard had been the first historian to consult original documents in Simancas and the Vatican, and was unsurprisingly perhaps skeptical about the notions of an indigenous antique church, a papacy encroaching on English sovereignty, and the Reformation as a moment of national liberation, which is so characteristic of much mainstream historical tradition. The very fact that we separate British history out from European history has entrenched nationalist and isolationist bias, which is implicit in this specifically Protestant historiography. Reflecting on Francis Bacon's certain articles or considerations touching the union of the kingdoms of Scotland and England, that created Britain. And I quote, "None can be an alien, but he that is of another allegiance." William Bailey comments, quote, that the British project is on one level an alternative to the continent, an attempt to establish another Europe. And I think all the things I'm saying now, I will come back to at the end of my talk, because I think in many ways, negotiations between Europe and Britain in the context of Brexit have revived many of these kinds of questions and concerns about what the relationship is between England and Spain. It's kind of inflected through that. So William Bailey has said that the British project is an alternative to the continent, an attempt to establish another Europe. And he reinforces that idea that we still speak of British and European history as in some way separate. The Marian period, in that sense, i.e. the reign of Mary I, was probably the last time that we were all Europeans. In the original version of the government's Life in the United Kingdom, A Journey to Citizenship, it was claimed that Mary I, quote, came to the throne with Spanish support, rather than through the defeat of Northumberland in a well-prepared counterattack that relied on her popularity and the religious sympathies of the majority in England. And yes, that is certainly I think the scholarly consensus is that the majority of the population in 1558, when Mary died, were undoubtedly Catholic. While this particular publication was produced under considerable time pressure and full of mistakes, this mistake is telling because it foregrounds the extraordinary persistence of this sectarian and providentialist Anglican history, informed by parochial anti-Catholic assumptions, and that that these things go on obscuring the true legacy of Mary and her Spanish husband. Bacon still located belonging to a political community in fealty, in allegiance to the person of the monarch, rather than the religious laws underlying the state's constitution. English and Spanish history in the 16th century were inseparably conjoined by three major dynastic marriages and a number of failed proposals. And I think religion and the role of religion in these matches is very, very interesting. Of course, first Arthur and then Henry were married to Catherine of Aragon, the kind of, one of the most important dynastic marriages of the 16th century. And then in the mid-Tudor period, Mary I married Philip II. And I think that marriage was undertaken more specifically for religious reasons in order to ensure the re-Catholicization of England. The latter, of course, was rejected by Elizabeth I. So he proposed to marry Elizabeth as soon as Mary died, but was rejected. And finally, of course, Charles I's unsuccessful attempt to, quote, I quote, mount Spain, as Gondomar described it, in the form of marrying the Spanish Hispanglia Ana, bringing to an end a courtship that had effectively lasted from the Treaty of London in 1605 until 1623. And that's the moment, of course, known as the Spanish match. So despite the series of armadas exchanged between England and Spain in the late 1580s and 90s, in 1600, the translator Francis Rivers could still argue powerfully for the enduring, profound affection and friendship of England and Spain. The dedication of his translation of Antonio Ortiz, and this is what you've got on the slide, a relation of the solemnity wherewith the Catholic princes King Philip III and Queen Margaret were received in the English College of Valladolid, the 22nd of August, 1600. So this is, again, worth remembering that there is a kind of significant English Catholic exiled population who sought refuge in Spain throughout this period, and there are a number of English colleges, not just in Valladolid, of course. The translation was dedicated to George Carey, who was Lord Hunsdon and the grandson of Anne Boleyn's sister Mary. It contains a surprising critique of late Elizabethan foreign policy and its antipathy to Spain. His gesture looks forward prophetically to the Treaty of London 5 years later, that eventually brings together the 3 decades of hostility. His Spanish Relación had caught Rivers' attention because of its discussion of the reasons for supporting recusant exiles, our English Catholic fugitives. Rivers wanted this tract to influence the English Privy Council to pursue peace for the sake of England's long-standing friendship with Spain. And he writes, the assurance of good meaning and known continuance of goodwill in them that were wont to be our best friends, though of late provoked to be our enemies, should encourage us much to peace and to renew the old confederations which our forefathers with so great wisdom procured so many ages, with so great benefit of the land, especially with those in whom yet under the profession of hostility and exercise of war, we find far better hearts and more true affection to our country and countrymen, as in this occasion may be seen, than in others whom with great care and cost we labor, I fear in vain, to make of old enemies new friends. I think that's probably largely a coded reference to France. This Hispanophile was not a crank. English interest in Spanish culture, history, and politics had intensified precisely during the period, when political relations deteriorated. During the 1570s, the translation of Spanish works surged, and I'm sorry, I've got this slightly out of order. The translation of Spanish works surged from only 6 titles in the previous decade to 23 titles a year. And then by the 1580s, there were as many as 50 titles being published a year. And in the 1590s, nearly 80 titles. Oh, sorry, not a year, it's across the decade, I beg your pardon. So yeah, so 6 titles in the 1560s, 23 in the 1570s, 50 in the 1580s, and 80 in the 1590s. So you can see there's a gradual uptick of translational interest in Spanish material at exactly the same moment when political hostilities are increasing. So those with an interest in Spanish culture included regime insiders as significant as William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, who, according to Barnaby Gooch, who translated Inigo López de Mendoza, the Marquis de Santillana, of course, his Proverbios, the Proverbs, and he wrote in his dedication to Cecil that Cecil was, I quote, perfectly able to judge whether I have truly and faithfully followed my pattern or no, because of course Burleigh spoke Spanish. English interest in Spain was not mutually incompatible with political prejudice. A quarter of the playwright John Fletcher's output was based on Spanish sources, largely Cervantes. Over 80% based on his favorite writer, 80% was based on his favorite writer, Cervantes. Fletcher's admiration for Spanish letters did not prevent him from devoutly wishing for a resumption of the armed conflict with Spain that had ended in 1605. So the complexity of English responses to Spain in the 16th and early 17th centuries needs to be seen in the context of England's admiration, envy, and fear of Western Europe's most powerful state. The evolution from fating Spanish colonial success, whatever the methods used to gain it, to denouncing Spanish cruelty and tyranny, was stimulated by Spain's expansionist imperial aspirations that had begun to threaten England directly. Religious difference was merely one of a number of factors driving the rivalry between the two countries. The perception of closeness and filiation ran parallel with enmity and hate. England's cultural Hispanophilia should be distinguished from the anti-Spanish sentiment that increasingly characterized English reactions to the Spanish on a political and religious level. And the gulf between elite and popular responses to Spain should also be recognized. This lecture aims to draw attention to the complexity of these diplomatic cultural exchanges, assimilation, competition, and cooperation that characterize the relationship. To understand this intricate alliance, we must avoid historiographical simplification that would focus exclusively on one facet, their envy or admiration, rivalry or contempt, love or hate, to the exclusion of considering the web of interrelated qualities characterizing the Anglo-Spanish relationship. Despite virulent, and so no, I've got on the slide here, this is the Anglo-Spanish, Spanish-English translation database, which is a database that I produced back in, actually no, I'm going to come on to that in a second. Sorry, let me deal with this first. So despite virulent anti-Spanish propaganda, like, for example, the copy of the Anti-Spaniard, the famous satirical scene in Ben Jonson's The Alchemist from 1610 made clear that English admiration for everything Spanish could verge on the gushingly embarrassing. Castrol says, "To be a countess, say you, a Spanish countess, sir, Why? Is that better than an English countess? Better? Slight make you that a question, lady? Nay, she is a fool, captain. You must pardon her. Ask from your courtier to your Inns of Court man, to your mere milliner. They will tell you all. Your Spanish jennet is the best horse. Your Spanish stoop is the best garb. Your Spanish beard is the best cut. Your Spanish ruffs are the best wear. Your Spanish pavan the best dance. Your Spanish titillation in a glove the best perfume. And for your Spanish pike and Spanish blade, let your poor captain speak. The passage moves from status symbols, synecdoches of courtly sophistication, to allusions to Spanish military dominance. The sycophantic admiration, however, is undercut by the comic satirical context. These images of fine horses, clothes, grooming, and dancing sit paradoxically alongside popular literary translations from the period, highlighting picaresque poverty and the deprivation and degradation of Spanish subjects. The picaresque genre dramatized the temporal and spatial mobility of early modern subjects, their existence beyond patriarchal surveillance and control, moving across boundaries and borders, vagrant and journeying. And they were, of course, closely associated with Spain. And indeed, in popular culture, the picaresque is, I think, even today, the picaresque is very closely associated with Spain and is often used as a kind of way of thinking about Spanish identity, national identity. The writing of historians on mid-Tudor England is exercised as much as anything else with our own relationship with Catholicism. From the penal laws that were only repealed in the 19th century to the fractious sectarianism of 20th century British politics in relation to Irish independence and republicanism. It's worth remembering that despite being subject to the Tudor state between 1586 and 1610, roughly 20,000 Irish soldiers saw service in Flanders. English Catholics did not disappear overnight after 1558, while the presence of numerous evangelicals in England throughout the period points to the huge complexity of making determinations about what people believed and how cherished these beliefs were. Many who had reformist leanings simply conformed under Mary. This does not mean there was an outbreak of Nicodemism, although in many cases this might be true. Instead, for many, the exact nature of ritual practices were a matter for the state, rather than individual conscience. It's important to bear in mind the fluidity of religious identities and the variegated nature of religion's importance to different kinds of people, as the cases of Thomas Geminus, John Haywood, and others remind us. So Thomas Geminus was a religious exile living in England when Mary came to the throne. He dedicated two of the most sophisticated maps, copperplate engravings that have been produced hitherto to the royal couple, despite his religious connections. Instead of seeing it as an interruption in the process of national liberation, we need to embrace its very internationalism. The way that England's engagement with the intellectual culture of Europe and Spain gave birth to the Counter-Reformation itself. England, if not inventing it, was certainly the crucible for many of the earliest experiments in clerical education of vernacular religious thought. And it's worth remembering that the Marian period is straddled by the Council of Trent. So the earliest sessions happened before the Marian period, and then the final sessions, finishing in 1563, happen after the end of this period. So moving on now to translation. Viewing English Catholicism in this period as a sterile anachronism, rather than a creative and vibrant source of new thinking, has been thoroughly contested by revisionist perspectives on the Reformation. Secondly, the Marian lies at the heart of what C.S. Lewis dubbed the drab age, a literary wasteland lacking the political interest of the Henrician period and the sophisticated vernacular forms that emerged by the middle of Elizabeth's reign. The notion that between 1547 and 1580, English literature retreated or lapsed into a pre-Henrician or pre-modern medieval state has rightly been contested. In a famous 1981 essay, J.W. Martin argued that the Marian establishment failed fundamentally to understand the importance of print. He criticized their lack of imagination in exploiting polemical opportunity, such as John Cheek's recantation of his religious views, and they pointed to their disinterest in communicating with the public at large, typified by their lack of support for the able Catholic propagandist Miles Hogarth. Trying to control the book trade and increase the distance between clergy and laity, far from being a retrograde step, though, and a symptom of their backwardness, it was actually a key element in their strategy for re-Catholicization. Works of religious controversy, even when perhaps they defended Catholic viewpoints, were not welcomed under Mary in the same way as they had been in the previous reign. Damping down the kind of discussion criticizing the proclamation on religious differences could hardly be achieved by engaging in further incendiary polemic. An outpouring of editions had followed the end of Henry's reign and the relaxation of the legislation regulating print. The number of titles printed in the years 1547 to 1550 was unsurpassed until after 1570. So although levels of production dropped under Mary, they were also lower for the first decade of the Elizabethan period as well. Far from misunderstanding print, it seems the Marian authorities understood its dangers all too well. I quote, "The Marian regime was from the beginning determined to impose discipline on the book trade, rightly recognizing that its most prominent members were men who owed their commercial success to the Edwardian Reformation." I think it's worth pointing out that the printing of Bibles and primers and kind of works of religious devotional material was a huge source of profit for printers under Edward, and then but not so much under Mary. So by September 1553, 9 of the 17 printers active at the time of Edward's death had closed down, including the 5 most prolific shops responsible for 60% of the total output during those years. Nevertheless, there were no definitive cases of printers fleeing into exile, despite the obvious reformist affiliations of many of them, nor was there any notable decline in the number of printers active under Mary, the figure dropping marginally from 29 to 26. Richard Grafton, the alderman principally responsible for the royal entry welcoming Philip and Mary into London in August 1554, was one of the very few who became inactive, no doubt in part because he printed the proclamation of Lady Jane Grey as Queen. What of cultural influence and the place of Hispanic worlds in English Renaissance culture? In my database, which is kind of shown on the slide, we identified 315 translations, while the Renaissance Cultural Crossroads Project at Warwick found 340. So some of those examples there. To give you a good example of the nature of this, I'm going to move forward into the 1580s and Gabriel Harvey's Marginalia on Antonio del Corro's The Spanish Grammar, with certain rules teaching both the Spanish and French tongues of 1590. Reproduced in the book is revealing of the nature of his interest, and I've basically there's a transcription of the Marginalia, and you can see La Vida de la Torre de Tormes. You can see Cortese et Medina Libri Hispanici de Arte Navigandi, etc. Guevara, the brave Indian histories of Hernando Cortés, the Examen de Ingenios, the Diana of Jorge de Montemayor, Boscan, Garcilaso, and so on. So it's very much a kind of summarization. These are all kind of canonical, very recognizable, Spanish literary texts. There are underlining and crosses in red throughout this edition of Antonio del Corro, and I should mention that Antonio del Corro was, of course, a religious exile living in England from Spain, and he translated and produced the Spanish grammar. So the bilingual lexicography was a hugely important part. So in some ways, religious difference promoted actually cultural exchange through the desire to engage with each other polemically in the vernacular language in which polemic was being carried out, as opposed to perhaps the more erudite medium of Latin. So there are a lot of underlines and crosses in red throughout Corro's text. For example, in the table of contents, the annotators picked out pronunciation, the noun, rules governing nouns in French and Spanish, the verb, to have and to be in Spanish and French, conjugations of French verbs, and so on. And the underlines in the table correspond to the sections of the text that have been marked up as well. All of the material listed here by Harvey at the end had been translated, which strongly suggests that the book list was designed to offer up multilingual versions of text specifically for the purposes of language learning. Up until 1640, there were 20 issues of picaresque titles, Lazarillo being a greater publishing success in England than its native Spain before 1600, a figure matched by translations of works on contemporary history. La vida de Lazarillo's interest in English is clear from the way that it's reframed. The running header, The Spaniard's Life, reinforced George Tuberville's verses, which suggested that Lázaro, quote, I quote, Lázaro deserves no blame, for it shows, I quote, how they live in Spain. 1624, the 1624 and 1639 editions, you got the title page of the 1624 edition there, claim that the book's purpose was expressing Spaniards in their kind. It's the last line of the poem on the left-hand side of the frontispiece. The life of is a recasting, echoing the French intermediary, as is the pleasant history. A literary genre halfway between romance and the novel is framed in terms of its value as documentary, offsetting the negative nature of its exemplarity. So you would think that Lazarillo de Tormes, as a kind of humanist, Erasmian satire of Catholic, spiritual abuses in lots of ways, a denunciation of bull selling, a denunciation of the kind of hypocritical religiosity of, pederast priests, priests who have mistresses, etc., etc. You would think that that would be a gift in a Protestant country, but for them it becomes a kind of travel guide. It doesn't become a sort of, it's not a kind of work of, it's not taken as a kind of literary satire. So it's subtly reframed in some ways to distance it from its English audience. The text also attacks, of course, the rigidity of class distinctions. And it's recast as a merciless satire of social mobility and pretentiousness and the very possibility of self-fashioning. So again, the rigidity in some ways, it suggests in some ways the huge rigidity of the Spanish class structure. Of the other texts that we have here, Martin Cortés and Pedro de Medina and Antonio de Guevara were the authors of three of the most influential navigational treatises which circulate in the period. Cortés had 7 editions in English from 1561, Medina had 2 and Guevara 1. Cortés's book had been brought back by Stephen Burrough from Spain, where he had had access to the Casa de Contratación in Seville, thanks to the marriage of Philip II and Mary I. The brave Indian histories were probably Thomas Nicholas's 1578 translation of Francisco Lope de Gomara. The Examination of Men's Wits had been translated via Italian by Richard Carew in 1594. Montemayor's Diana, of course, had been translated by Bartholomew Young, appearing in 1598, although it had been circulating in manuscript since the 1570s. And it's a huge influence on Philip Sidney, of course, that particular text. Boscan and Garcilaso originally featured in Barnaby Goodge's Eclogues, Epitaphs and Sonnets in 1563, and were set alongside Sir Philip Sidney, Sallust and Torquato Tasso, Virgil and Homer in Abraham France's The Arcadian Rhetoric from the Armada year of 1588, a text dedicated to Mary Sidney, which is part of a movement to memorialize Sidney and continue the project to explore the relationship between language and empire. So Philip Sidney is often seen in some ways as one of the foremost proponents of a vernacular literature in English. His very kind of construction is mediated through Spanish translation, interestingly. His readings of the poems were, so this is France's readings of the poems, were filtered through the Spanish humanist Fernando de Herrera's edition of Garcilaso's works from 1580, following in many cases his eccentric readings, as well as echoing Young's annotations on a 1550 Antwerp edition of Boscan and Garcilaso, which is now in the British Library. Language learning materials such as that of Corro lay ahead of the picaresque with a staggering 31 issues. And I think John Mincheu's dictionaries and, of course, Richard Percival's Treasury of the Spanish Tongue are kind of 2 examples of the massive importance that Spanish and Spanish language learning came to acquire in England in the 1580s and 1590s. So there were 31 issues of language learning materials, only slightly less than the biggest literary category, the Romances of Chivalry, with which Harvey's survey of translated material ends on 37 titles. However, dwarfing every other genre in translational terms is Counter-Reformation literature, devotional treatises and works of theology, And hagiographies accounted for almost, these together accounted for almost a fifth of all translation activity, much illegally produced outside Britain for the recusant and exile market. One representative example of this surprising influence is the work of Luis de Granada, with 27 issues of translations between 1582 and 1632. And in particular, the translation of his Libro de Oración y Meditación, Book of Prayer and Meditation from 1554, by the Catholic exile Richard Hopkins. During Elizabeth's reign, more than 200 Catholic titles were published in English. To prevent the influx, special customs officials were appointed in London, and all booksellers who sold foreign books were obliged to provide lists of their titles to be vetted before going on sale. Large rewards were offered to informers, and recusant households were frequently raided. Government proclamations followed one another in rapid succession. March 1569, July and November 1570, November 1571, September 1573, October 1584, and July 1588. Attacking, and I quote, infamous scrolls and bills, traitorous books and bulls, as it were, from Rome, seditious books and traitorous devices against the laws and government of the realm. The appearance of Protestant translations of the same text made the identification of Catholic books with treason more complicated. As early as 1569, the proclamations began to include books made or translated. A list of books confiscated from Sir Thomas Tresham's house at Hogston included 2 of Hopkins's Granada translations. I quote, a manual of prayers dedicated to the gentlemen of the Inns of Court, and a book of prayers and meditation. A quote, catalogue of the superstitious books and relics found in the lodging and study of George Broome and in the lodging of Elizabeth and Bridget Broome, sisters of the said George of 1586, is suggestive of the gendered appeal of this devotional literature. George's books were dominated by polemic, a discourse containing reasons why Catholics refused to come to church, Campion's Book of Decamrationes, a reply against the false named defense of the truth, a treatise of Christian peregrination, and of pilgrimage and relics, while Elizabeth and Bridget's books were devotional and included Richard Hopkins's A Manual of Prayers with a Jesus Psalter in the End, imprinted 1586, and, I quote, a treatise made by Luis de Granado, provincial of the Holy Order of Preachers in the province of Portugal, translated out of Spanish into English. The popularity of devotional literature in Granada specifically was exceptional. By 1634, 14 editions of a corrected Protestant version of Hopkins's translation had been published at London presses, outnumbering the Catholic issues by nearly 2 to 1. The first issue of a Protestant version of Hopkins's translation suppressed both the translator and Granada's names, although the Spanish Dominican's name reappeared on the text from 1599 onwards. Now, I'm not going to go into this here, but you've got the original of Granada as the first quotation on the slide. Then you have the Hopkins translation, and then you have the 1599 Protestant translation. So I'm not going to kind of critique and go through this in detail. But I think what's really striking about this here is the fact that Hopkins Catholicizes Granada. He kind of inserts Counter-Reformation Catholic theology into the Spanish mystics' original text. And then the Protestant version is more or less identical, bar a very, very, very slight, couple of very, very slight minor changes. So the first works of bilingual lexicography in English date from early in Mary's reign. A very profitable book to learn the manner of reading, writing, and speaking English contains sample dialogues in parallel columns, while the Book of English and Spanish was a vocabulary and phrase book. Clearly designed to be of practical use to the thousands of Spanish travelers and English merchants, artisans, and others who needed to interact with each other in the context of the dynastic match of the century. These language learning phrase books are fascinating because of the way they envisage the types of exchanges and dialogues most useful for travelers. Oops, sorry, I won't go on to that yet. Unfortunately, their specific content cannot be related to the marriage because the Book of English and Spanish was extracted and reordered from a polyglot Sex Linguarum, Latini, Gallici, Hispanici, Italici, Anglici, et Teutonicae, while a very profitable book is an adaptation of a German work, a vocabulary in Dutch, French, Latin, and Spanish. compiled by Noël van Barlemont, and used the Spanish from that and simply added English translations. The latter book was divided into 4, giving examples of conversation at meat, of fashions of buying and selling, of how to call upon debtors and how to write epistles, obligations, and quittances. And it included sections on how to admonish debtors, the manner of paying debt to any with an excuse. In the 3rd section, how to call on debtors, there's a delightful exchange where one character says, why I come to you? No, verily, who are you? What means this? Have you forgotten that of late you bought some of our merchandise? The sample dialogues imagine conviviality, as well as some of the difficulties implicit in being a foreigner involved in mercantile exchange, such as negotiating the exact exchange rate for a foreign coinage. One section details a disagreement as to whether a coin is worth 36.5 stufas, which is translated as placas in Spanish. A number of mistakes are apparent in the Spanish translations, suggesting the anonymous adapter was not a native speaker, but probably a Habsburg subject from the Low Countries, Bruges, Antwerp. Bruges, Antwerp, and Ghent are all alluded to in the section on debt. Come in is rendered as entradad aquí, overcome is vencidado, while brown is translated as morón en vez de marrón, and buen paño y buen lienzo is simplified as good woolen cloth, as opposed to cloth and linen. At times, there were some well-chosen idiomatic equivalents. Good wife, what is the price of, being rendered from Señora, ¿cuánto pedís por la vara? Although there is additional information included in the Spanish, the qualification by the yard. Parts deal with the days of the week, names, forms of address, and many daily fashions of speaking, which we use when we sit at meat, as well as idiomatic phrases for postprandial conversation. Both texts possess a significant religious content, including translations of the Pater Noster, Ave Maria, Articles of Faith, the 10 Commandments, and Grace at the Table, in a very profitable book. And God and the Trinity, the 7 Works of Mercy, the 7 Deadly Sins, the Devil, Hell, and Purgatory in the Book of English and Spanish. In addition to pragmatic economic exchanges, they also model violent confrontation. I am evil pleased. Yo soy mal contento. Thou liest. Tú mientes. I am beguiled. Soy engañado, of a knave, de un bellaco, as well as more intimate situations such as sharing a bed. For thou dost no thing all night but snore, porque toda la noche no haces sino roncar. The main intention of these 2 language learning textbooks, according to the subject matter, was the promotion of trade. Their principal market must have been amongst the 2,000 artisans who followed Philip to settle in London and those who traded with them. So in spite of the kind of problematic political relationship in the 1580s and 90s, relations between England and Spain continued to be relatively cordial well into the 17th century. At Charles II's restoration in 1661, the Spanish ambassador's coach was, I quote, escorted by a crowd, which came out of all the shops applauding the event with words and cries, showing great affection for Spain, even ringing bells in some places, and followed the coach to the very embassy. Robert Parsons' vision of historic Anglo-Spanish harmony in News from Spain and Holland, 1593, culminates in the narrator's visit to the English church of St. George in Sanlúcar, Sevilla, whose existence reminds the reader of, and I quote, larger patterns of commercial, religious, political, dynastic exchange that have historically bound the 2 countries together. Notions of an essential incompatibility between the 2 people and of a threat of contamination to English visitors in Spain are simply Protestant fictions. The significance of the reign of Philip and Mary lies in what its historiographical misfortunes say about the nature of and writing of history itself. Its marginalization bears a direct relationship to a particular version of English identity and reflects how big a part of confessional difference has gone on playing in that historiography. While presentist comparisons can be reductive as much as illuminating, the frequent invocation of the Reformation as the original Brexit by politicians, journalists, and schools forces Mary into the unexpected role of bloody Romaniac, I suppose a kind of representative of the cosmopolitan elitist intellectual Remainers, such as myself, as opposed to the populist ethno-nationalism of Henry VIII and the Reformation. The oddity of this comparison reminds us how much our history turns on the connections and disconnections out of which we fabricate it. The acceptability of Mary's foreign marriage will no doubt continue to inflect the evolving relationship between Britain and Europe and its cultural politics. While there is no major monument to Mary in England, she's buried beneath Elizabeth, of course, with the phrase partners both in throne and grave, which is an odd running together of the two Tudor sisters, England's first regnant queen and then England's second regnant queen. There's no major monument to her. Her tomb lies below that of her half-sister Westminster Abbey. But in Madrid, however, a tube station was named Maria Tudor after her in 2007 on a street of the same name. It's interesting the way in which both Spain and Britain define themselves continues to be so profoundly entwined. At the culmination of the Netflix smash hit, Casa de Papel, or Money Heist, Lisboa persuades the vicious Coronel Tamayo to accept back bars of tin in the place of the nation's gold reserves, commenting, pues, no escribieron el Lazarillo de Tormes los ingleses, ¿verdad? The English didn't write Lazarillo de Tormes, did they? And while that is certainly true, it was translated and went on to influence the development of prose fiction and the English novel from Joseph Andrews to Jonathan Wild. The early modern period continues to be a key in understanding Hispanglia, the entangled histories and cultures of Spain and England. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexander. Fantastic lecture. And now the floor is open for your questions, suggestions. I would like, a very obvious question for you who are a specialist, but when we think about the Lazarillo de Tormes, the translation into English, it came with some introductions and explanations, because Lazarillo de Tormes is so Spanish, and picaresca is something really from the peninsula. So to me, it seems quite difficult how the British of that time, or even of nowadays, could understand, even in English, a text like Lazarillo de Tormes.
Well, I think personally, that's a great question. I think it was immediately understandable because, Lazarillo de Tormes is part of a European-wide humanist culture, from the 1540s and 1550s. So I think on one level, it was immediately recognizable. So it's translated by David Rowlands in 1586. Now that's 2 years before the Armada is sent to invade England. And it's dedicated to Sir Thomas Gresham, who was a great kind of merchant. And of course, Sir Thomas Gresham was the man who traveled to Spain in 1554 to arrange for Mary's dowry to be paid by letters of exchange from Seville to Antwerp, and then from Antwerp to London. So in some ways, yes, it was framed as a kind of travel guide. So basically, Rowlands, in his introduction, essentially says, if you want to know how people live in Spain, read this book. It tells you everything you need to know. It's a kind of almost like a work of documentary. So my point was, it's kind of flattened out, whereas we would think of it as a work of satire, and we would think of the picaresque, as comic perhaps, rather than serious or documentary, but it was received as if it were kind of documentary. So there's a kind of generic resituation of the picaresque genre, and it's hugely popular. The picaresque goes on being translated and republished, and it's massively influential. Joseph Andrews is a kind of English picaresque novel. It's one of the great sort of 18th century novels, kind of defining of the English novel, really. And it is directly influenced by Spanish literature. Joseph Andrews says on the title page of Joseph Andrews that it's a novel written in the style of Don Quixote. So I would say, what I would say, Pedro, is that actually the way that the picaresque now is taken to be representative of Spanish national identity is something that happened after the event, if you see what I mean. That when the picaresque was written, when Lazarillo came out, when Guzmán de Alfarache came out, when La Pícara Justina was first published, James Mabb translated Guzman de Alfarache as the Rogue, and there were, a cluster of editions in the 1630s. So it was the most widely read prose fiction in England at that time, because there weren't really equivalents to it. So I think, it's a fascinating question, but I think, the picaresque's association as something peculiarly Spanish it is something which is subsequent. I mean, there's a great survey of Spanish, kind of sociological survey about the Spanish people in comparison to other Europeans, and it essentially said that the Spanish were least likely to trust each other. They were the least trusting of all Europeans, and that somehow was related to the determining role of the picaresque in Spanish national identity. This kind of distrust of other people, that they're always going to try and screw you over. And it's linked, I think, as well to the perception that Spain is an inherently more corrupt country than Anglo-Saxon countries, because they were the country that that invented the picaresque genre. So when I talk to Spanish friends about various scandals in Spain, political scandals, they throw up their hands and say, la picaresca española, as if that's a kind of an explanation. So I think it's really interesting, actually, how things which were originally fictions become adopted as critical aspects of national identity, but only subsequently, not at the time.
Thank you. Any comments or questions from our audience? Yeah, please do ask any questions that you have. I mean, I know that was probably it might have been a bit heavy. I suppose La Celestina was also translated. Yes, absolutely. Translated again by James Mabb in 1631. But actually, we know that it was translated much earlier than that. It was translated in 1599 and influenced things like The Night of the Burning Pestle in, I think that's 1607, I believe. So the manuscript translation of La Celestina circulated long before it was printed in 1631. Thank you. So if there are no more questions or comments, I thank you again, Alexander. It was very enriching, this wonderful lecture about the mutual influence of Spain and the United Kingdom, and especially in this case, your lecture about the influence of Spain in England and Britain as a whole. Thank you very much for your wonderful lecture, and thank you also to our audience for being with us. Muy buenas noches y hasta muy pronto.